Hello, everyone. I'm joined by Richard Carrier, Clever Dick Films, one of the, I think, preeminent YouTube Doctor Who creators. Um, and just to give you obviously people who watch your series of videos in which you're going through each of the eras, each of the Doctors, we know your history with the show, but just to give a quick thing about me to contrast against you, I didn't have the BBC when I was growing up, so I didn't grow up with Doctor Who. But I used to, Star Trek was my main fandom and Star Wars. And I used to buy magazines like Starlog and SFX and, Cult Times and all these things. So through osmosis, I used to read everything about Doctor Who, even though I'd never seen an episode. So like, I knew what the key to time was and like Bessie and Sean Carr and all these stuff, but I'd never seen a single episode. So I watched an interview with you recently where you mentioned how was Logopolis your first episode? Did you
Well, it's a
remember?
bit difficult to say, yeah, because I was very little during the sort of tail end of when Doctor Who was actually on television originally, the classic series. The one I could remember, like for definite watching, was during the 30th anniversary. There was a weekend on UK Gold, sort of celebrating Doctor Who, and people had voted for. I think they'd voted for a particular Doctor they wanted to see, and UK Gold had just picked an episode. But that was the thing; they didn't even pick the whole story; they just picked the odd episode. So, yeah, probably the one I can distinctly remember the most watching the first time was probably the last episode of Logopolis, which is obviously Tom Baker's farewell story
Yeah.
and the farewell episode. So I could have been kind of put off with like not knowing what on earth is going on, but it kind of really piqued my interest because there were a lot of elements of Doctor Who regeneration, the Master, different planets, different companions, and all that kind of thing. I was definitely aware of it before then. And I watched it when it was few and far between repeated on television following the 30th anniversary. I think really when I became a big fan of it was probably following the Paul McGann TV movie, because finally, although I'd been watching the odd videotape and things like that, it suddenly became a bit more contemporary for me. So,
Yeah.
but then of course it didn't lead to anything. So I then had to go and search out. That was when I really sort of went to the effort of searching out and watching all of it.
Yeah.
So my fandom was similar in a way because it was something that I had to seek out and find and read
Well,
Doctor Who magazine and
that's the
things like
funny thing
that.
because I'm a big Marvel Comics fan, and they obviously were doing tie-in comics, and I used to see Paul
Yeah,
McGann's face everywhere, and I assumed he was more of a fixture. Actually, I didn't
yeah,
realize,
yeah.
yeah, how brief stint it was. But for me, when the show came back, I had plans to finally sort of embrace it, but I still didn't have BBC. And what was happening was I visited my brother who lived in Glasgow, and the reason why I was bringing up the episode you saw saying about how there was Hallmark elements to it, the first
Mm.
episode I saw was School Reunion, which also kind of
Oh,
does
right.
that job because you have Sarah Jane
Mm.
Smith, which obviously references the past. You have it causes tension in his relationship with Rose. So you kind of get all the elements. Um, and also, I was a big Buffy fan, and Auntie Stewart Head is in it. And I was like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, well played, Doctor Who. And then the next episode I saw was Girl in the Fireplace, and thus a fandom was born. So basically, I wanted to talk to you because of the sort of seismic news that came out this week
Mm.
concerning the 60th anniversary and the return of Russell T Davies. Now that
Mhm.
we've established that the BBC weren't crying wolf or bad wolf, as the case may be, and he is coming back. Okay, I wanted to ask you because you were the person I wanted to get insights from without getting into any sort of like I think I said this to you before we started that I don't want this to become a screaming into the void hate tube thing.
Oh, it
I don't
certainly
agree with any
won't.
of that stuff. Yeah, it certainly won't between us. But just what is your feeling on the current state of the show before we discuss the plans for RTD to come back to it? How do you feel about the Chibnall era? We do not come to bury Chibnall or Jodie Whittaker because I think there's a lot of elements that are actually good to it. But I'm just curious, what are your views on the current state of the show?
Well, I've enjoyed the last two seasons. In some ways, I think there's been a few uh, missteps in the sense. Well, one big thing I think that I've said since the beginning, and it was an attitude towards the program that I already had, which was this idea of having too many companions, certainly with a new Doctor, because obviously with the 45-minute runtime of an episode, it's somewhat challenging sometimes to really do those characters justice and give everyone the sort of airtime that they can do. And I felt that from the Davison era, albeit those stories were episodic, they were serialized, so there was a bit more time. But I always felt that Peter Davison's Doctor suffered somewhat from the fact that he had this ensemble of companions. And I think the Jodie Whittaker incarnation has similarly suffered somewhat from having a focus sometimes away from her, so she hasn't been able to really stamp her identity, perhaps to the same extent that some of the previous New Who Doctors have been. So that's a bit of a one aspect that I think might be a little bit I would criticize. But then saying that, one thing that I've really enjoyed, I've applauded the kind of the confidence of going into, a different, to some extent, vision of Doctor Who, of exploring certainly a little bit more diversity behind from a production point of view. And that's something that Stephen Moffat lamented a little bit towards the end of his time. I think he wrote an article in Doctor Who magazine where he said, we have a responsibility to reflect a wider sort of voice of the people, and I think that's the irony, really, because I think a lot of people like to reduce criticism to individuals and personify it and say, obviously, Chris Chibnall's hands on the tiller, but I think that the program is more of a from behind the scenes, more of an ensemble effort than in previous years of New Who. I think that Chibnall certainly wanted to assemble a writer's room from the beginning in the same way that a lot of other flagship programs do, and I think that has benefited the show. We've got. I think arguably there's a consistency to the show that has been lacking somewhat in previous years.
It's funny. I'm
obviously
afraid...
there's really good stories and there's weaker stories, but generally there's kind of a consistency in approach, which perhaps was a little bit different before.
Yeah, I'm almost afraid to ask you your views on like the Matt Smith Capaldi era, because I do want to wait for your videos in which you talk about it. It's like spoilers for someone's opinion, but I feel like what I think about the Chibnall era is that, like, I know from watching your work that you're a fan of the historicals as well, which they've very much tackled with gusto with Chibnall's era thus far.
Yeah.
Your point about the companions, I think one of the episodes that best services everyone and tells like a rollicking good story was the like Nikola Tesla episode. Like that would be a platonic ideal for the current status. I just the problem is though it falls into people just, as you said, demonizing one person or demonizing the idea of diversity and all this nonsense.
Yeah.
When it has been fairly consistent, and there's been stuff I really like about it. I prefer Sacha Dhawan's Master to John Sims' Master, for example. Obviously Missy is the better incarnation, but yeah. So here's the thing: you're not someone who was. You're not someone who thinks the show needed to be fixed or anything, because that is a weird thing.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I think that my approach to the show might be a little bit different to some people is because having grown up with the show when it was off the air, Doctor Who, for me, there was never like a current Doctor as such. I mean, you could argue that McGann and slightly before that McCoy was my Doctor, but they weren't on television. It wasn't a current thing. So my enjoyment of it was always like, I'll watch a bit from the 60s, I'll watch a bit from the 70s, a bit from the 80s. And I was very familiar with how the show could be very different in some respects, the way that it was made and the kinds of stories and the kind of style of it. So I apply that same approach, I think, and always have done to the modern era, in that I don't find change and development as perhaps as off-putting as some people. I think a lot of people got very, very fixated on one particular sort of style of Doctor Who, the sort of Russell T Davies style of Doctor Who and the kind of characters in that, and have found it very difficult to then adjust to a different approach. And I think sometimes those people might lack that wider perspective that Doctor Who has always celebrated change while keeping some fundamental things the same.
Not a moment
Sorry,
too
I'm just going to
soon.
have to pause one
Sorry,
moment, I'm afraid, just because you may notice that my dog is whining at the door,
that's
and my
fine.
wife was supposed to be keeping him quiet.
My cat might come across the screen a number of times, just to warn you.
That's fine. Oh, I think he wants to wander in and sit down here with me, so he shouldn't be too
um,
disruptive anyway. Sorry about that.
that's cool. We can edit this. But I do want to ask you as well. With Russell T Davies, my feeling on RTD in general is that he's sort of like he has what I call marquee energy. He knows
Mm,
how to make a show and how to like
yeah.
market it and whatever. And I feel like even though I was a fan, Matt Smith, I suppose it was kind of Matt Smith was my first contemporary Doctor, the first one I sort of was watching as it was happening, and it has remained a favorite. Um, I do feel that the marquee mainstream energy was kind of seeping as Moffat's era went on. I think maybe
Yeah.
like the second season with the silence, and that might have been the last time. Obviously, the 50th anniversary generated some stuff as well, but I
Mm.
feel like people sort of tailed off after the Big Bang, we'll say. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that to some extent. Yeah, certainly, and certainly following the 50th anniversary, and then Capaldi's era, I think the general popularity of the show went down. However, I don't necessarily see that as a reflection on
the
the quality
quality,
of the program, but more of the
yeah,
fact that I was saying the other day how it's interesting how the vast majority of the time when I see criticism of Doctor Who, it tends to be people comparing it to itself rather than to other television programs. And I think sometimes that's an interesting perspective. That I mean, that in itself is informative, but also I think there's an interesting perspective to kind of narrow it down to that. You know, to compare viewing figures and things like that to other time periods within Doctor Who, and that can be a bit misleading sometimes. I think one thing that we we can easily forget is that Doctor Who now, the new series is obviously there's a series 13 that's coming up, but it's been back since 2005. And if we
oh
think
yeah,
about other programs, big programs that have been on, they've come and gone, you know, in that time, and popularity and the impact that it has on the kind of zeitgeist will fluctuate and move. I mean, saying that, you could argue, of course, that when they regenerate the Doctor and change the style and the branding and all that, there's an opportunity there to hit again. But I think that the impact that Doctor Who had on its return in 2005 was much more significant than perhaps some people realize, in that it really certainly in Britain, it changed the television landscape in the sense of what production companies were willing to tackle. You know, up until that point, people had kind of said, well, we can't do this in England. We can't do science fiction. We can't do fantasy. And that's something I sort of touched upon in my video. I think it was in my David Tennant video where I talked about how suddenly you had shows like Merlin and you had
and
Robin Hood,
Primeval
and
and
to
stuff.
some
Yeah, yeah.
extent, yeah, probably you had like Misfits, and you had people willing to say, and now that kind of landscape has shifted. Doctor Who is no longer necessarily the it doesn't stand out necessarily as much amongst that landscape because there's so many programs, and also there's a generally, since that time period, I think the audience, the television audience for science fiction and fantasy has increased. The normalization of being a fan, thankfully, has become a lot more extended, and so people are much more, the not wees are generally watching things like Game of Thrones or things like that. So
You spoke about in an interview I saw about how no one directly said something to you as a kid, but that sort of stigma of being a fan. And like I was
mm,
in school, I was mocked for reading comics and watching Star
mm,
Trek, and now these are two, like, obviously the MCU is the biggest thing in the world, and it is
yeah,
funny
yeah,
how it's all come around. Um, so you think Russell T Davies coming back has been met with like a huge sort of interest. I'm slightly mixed about it personally. Like I actually really like Russell's era, but it does feel like change is in the heart, is in the two hearts of the show, and
yeah,
it should.
yeah.
And I feel like stepping backwards, and it slightly maybe smacks of desperation, but then I can't deny that I'm curious about what he'll do as well. Um,
Yeah, I think that. I mean, I'm excited about it. I am excited about it, and that's from someone who I love all of Doctor Who, um, but I would say that the Russell T Davies era is not necessarily my favorite era. I would argue more that as a writer, I prefer Stephen Moffat, for example, and a lot of the kind of ideas that he wove in, certainly in the early years of his tenure. But I think that there's a lot to unpick with this whole process, and I think that we won't know for several years until, you know, all the PR spin kind of disappears, exactly what's going on behind the scenes. But I think we're at a big moment of change generally within television. You know, the rise of things like streaming and on-demand television, the kind of slow dismantling in a way of the BBC and what they used to be as to what they're kind of becoming politically, etc. And so I think this is a way to ensure the continuity of something that is a flagship program, because obviously one of the things that I thought was quite interesting coming out of the interview or the column that Chris Chibnall wrote in Doctor Who magazine recently, where he said about how people asked him, like, why haven't you appointed your successor? Obviously, this is before Russell T Davies came in, and I'm sure he was already aware that this was going on. But he was saying that one of the big differences that's happened under his time is that it's now made by BBC Studios as opposed to the BBC as a company as we know it. Although they've got the same kind of name, it sounds a little, and I don't know all the ins and outs of that, but it kind of gives me the impression that it's becoming a bit more corporatized, and a bit more trying to compete perhaps with those other things, because the model of the BBC up to now has survived, but it's something that is slowly being eroded. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if and I'm certainly not an expert, but I wouldn't be surprised in 15 years or so if the BBC, in order to survive, becomes some sort of subscription service similar to Netflix.
And there is a clip circulating of Russell T Davies lamenting what that would mean for the future of television and the services it would provide that it wouldn't be able to do anymore.
Yeah. I think, though, to go back to Russell T Davies, though, I think I share that I shared that initial sort of feeling somewhat. I mean, one thing that I had immediately as I saw it was a great sense of relief, not because I feel that Doctor Who needs saving as a program. That kind of suggests that I'm not happy with the way it is or the way it's gone. I am happy. I recognise that perhaps that area or the direction that it's gone in, and with the sort of general social kind of debate about things and the discourse about media and everything is sort of very polarized at the moment, and everyone feels like they need to take a side. That might push a few buttons and therefore become a little bit of a hot potato and not as mega popular as it was before. And with the fact that I knew the show was the current iteration of the show was coming to an end, Chibnall was moving on, Whittaker's moving on, and there didn't seem to be, talking to my wife literally 3 or 4 nights ago, just saying, you know, it doesn't sound like they've got a plan. I was saying to her, it seems like, you know, because if they had it sorted, then they'd have something in place. They'd have to be filming it now. We'd know about it, because they can't keep these things secret, not in the modern day.
Never.
I've been amazed at how much Chibnall has kept secret, but you wouldn't be able to keep big production secret. So,
like Fugitive of the Jejune was like bizarre, and how that didn't, all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And so they've been very clever and savvy in that way, but in the sense of like a new production team stepping in and starting to take care of it, I don't think that's something they could have kept secret. And I wouldn't be surprised if the press release that finally announced Russell T Davies's new taking over of the show wasn't rushed out because it was going to be leaked, in the same way that David Tennant's casting as the Doctor was going to be leaked, and all those, because it just seems a little bit it seems a bit unfair to me on this coming series.
It's overshadowing his last series.
So I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't expecting to hold off on that for a little bit longer and announce it. Although it does neatly dovetail into the fact that, what was it, however many years ago now, this exact weekend was the time they announced the original new version of Who coming back. But yeah, no, I am excited for it. Because I think that Russell T Davies is someone who has constantly developed and evolved. I think he's a better writer now than he was ever before. I always thought that he's a good writer. He knows how to write character. He knows how to write emotion, and I know that's something that helped to make the show appeal to a wider audience, perhaps developing it a little bit and making it a bit more sophisticated in its character interactions. Sometimes maybe those interactions were a little bit too unsubtle, a little bit too on the nose, but I think that he's been making so many great programs since he left Doctor Who that I don't think that what we're going to get is a return to the same style and the same sort of stories that we had then. I think it's going to be different. I wouldn't say that, for example, if Stephen Moffat came back, I don't think we would see what we were going to see the same kinds of things he did before, for good or ill. And I do hope, I doubt it'll happen because he probably had a gutful, but I do hope in some way that Russell T Davies does convince some of those writers who we haven't heard from, like Stephen Moffat, like Paul Cornell, and people back from the early days of New Who coming back to pen a few stories. But I also hope that he will continue a lot of the work that Chibnall's done in diversifying the voices in the writers and in the directorial team and things like that, and build on some of the developments. Because I mean, if you compare not just from a technical point of view, but also from a point of view of like not just like special effects and things, but just like the cinematography and the sophistication of how Doctor Who is filmed now. Compare that back to Series 1 or even Series 2. It's a very different show these days.
Oh, yeah.
It has a different kind of aesthetic, and I hope that, although being the head writer, he's not really responsible so much for the aesthetics, but I do hope that he carries forward and builds on the success of those things. So it's a development and a step forward. And it does remind me a little bit, although it's not quite the same. I said this on Twitter the other night, that there is some precedent for this in some way, in the fact that when John Nathan Turner became the producer, the BBC brought in Barry Letts again from, at that point, arguably the most successful period of Doctor Who, which had been the John Pertwee era, sort of most comparable, I suppose, to the Russell T Davies era in the sense of its general popularity and its how much it had gone into the public consciousness, to kind of oversee it as an executive producer and have some say in the decisions and the way it was done. And I think it's a little bit like, it reminds me a little bit like that. I don't think it was kind of a action stations, we need to save this sinking ship kind of thing. I think it's reflective of how the BBC as an organisation is developing and how they wanted to ensure that it survives that, rather than what's gone before, but what's coming, if you saw what I mean. This is very much armchair rationalising, but I do think it's more to do with the developments in the industry as a whole and in the way the BBC works than with how Chris Chibnall's era has gone down. Which, there's some incredibly good stories and some great popular stories as well, outside of the vocal minority that you hear from that moan and bemoan this and that. I mean, the irony with a lot of comments that people say is that they backtrack on them later, or it's always like, now is the time when it's ruined, when they said it was ruined 3 times before.
The Moffat haters were wishing him back within a season of Chibnall. Like, people always forgive him. Actually, it's funny you mentioned the Pertwee era, because that actually gives us a nice segue to the first video I saw of yours was the Pertwee one. It showed up on my algorithm.
Right.
Possibly because I'm a big Third Doctor fan, so. But that was the first video of yours I saw, and then obviously I went back. And I just wanted to talk about the overview of the eras that you're doing. I said this, but I really think your coverage is amazing. I think it should be like on TV. I think you're very even-handed, and even though there's personal stuff in there as well, and you say what you don't like about eras, it never gets into any sort of backbiting kind of stuff. But what was the exact, like, what prompted you to decide I am going to tackle in such detail, forensic detail that you did? What was the actual, like, the genesis of that?
Well, I think there was a few factors. There was circumstance. I had reduced some of the responsibility I had at work, so I had a little bit more of a work-life balance. I studied film and media at university, and then I became a teacher, weirdly, and found that I didn't have time being a teacher to do some of those things. So it was kind of like a long gestating sort of thing in my mind that I wanted to do something, but I didn't necessarily have the expertise and time to put into doing a group film in some way with other people. And I wanted to sort of see what I could get away with just on my own. I'm a little bit of a megalomaniac like that. I like to have my fingers in all the pies and say, oh, can I do that? Can I do a bit of animation? Can I do a bit of sound design? Can I do a bit of editing and all that kind of thing? So I knew I had the experience to do videos and things like that. I'd done it at university and in my own time prior. And I was thinking, with this better life work balance I'd managed to arrange for myself, I was thinking, I want, now is the time, I want to do something. What can I do? And of course, I eat, sleep, and dream Doctor Who. So I thought it's probably going to have something to do with this. And I thought, I don't necessarily want to make a fictional Doctor Who, because I didn't think necessarily that I would be able to pull that off convincingly, and certainly not on my own. So I thought, well, why don't I make some sort of documentary? And I've always enjoyed the documentaries and the fantastic work that goes into the bonus features on the Doctor Who DVDs, and taking it to new heights now with the Blu-ray versions. But I felt that there was, for a number of reasons, which I can only surmise some of them, which is perhaps to do with things like copyright and expense and things like that, because obviously I use a lot of material in my videos which you'd have to seek out a great number of copyright holders sort of get permission in order to put it on something that you were aiming to make profit with. So I felt that in a way I had an opportunity with a non-profit YouTube video that wasn't going to be sold on DVDs and things like that, that I could perhaps be a bit more comprehensive, or show a bit more breadth than the official sort of thing. So there was that aspect. I think what I was doing was I'd seen all of Doctor Who before, but I had got to the point where the DVDs had obviously had been released in a sort of higgledy-piggledy order. So I've sort of amassed them all. And they'd got to the point where they'd finally basically finished the range, and I had an almost entire collection. And I thought, right, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch all of Doctor Who in order from the beginning, for as long as it takes, and including the missing stories, which I have the audios of. Obviously, we've got a lot of fantastic animations now to watch as well, but I had the audios and the telesnaps I'd saved on my computer, sort of little images to follow along the ones that exist, and I was watching them all through, and it gave me...
It's very similar to the Running Through Corridors books, which I was reading in conjunction. If the Robert Sherman, Toby project. So it does sound like that, just sitting down and going through each thing.
Yeah, and it gave me some interesting perspectives, because although I wasn't watching it exactly as people had seen it, because it would have taken me 50 years to do that, once a week or something, it gave me some interesting perspectives and challenged some of the sort of held views that I had. It was interesting to see how the show developed and fluctuated, and also encouraged me to find out a bit more information about the background to the production of it, that I'd already sort of consumed all this and digested it all in my brain, but I was sort of going back and looking at Doctor Who magazines and buying books. And I was going on YouTube likewise to sort of see what other people had done and whether they had any similar kind of viewpoints that I had. And I wasn't really finding the kind of thing I was looking for. So I thought, well, I'll just have a go at making it myself. So one day I sat down and wrote an introductory. Go on.
I was just wondering, did going back and doing the research for this, did it flip any opinions you had? Like, did a doctor you love suddenly go down the ranking or anything like that? Did it?
Not really with the doctors. I generally actually developed an even greater appreciation, because a lot of the I've been reading articles and things like that for many years and learning production and context and things like that, but actually watching the story and then reading the context, production context, and also social historical context behind it, it became what I love about Doctor Who, which has always been like a springboard to appreciate lots of different subjects. So it was sort of a learning opportunity that enriched my enjoyment. There were some stories that I had always thought of as I quite enjoyed, which on rewatching them in the context of the larger ones, and maybe it was because of I hadn't watched them in a few years and I'd come around to watching it again, my opinion was revised a little bit. Like, I always loved, I had a double video cassette copy of Frontier in Space when I was a kid. and I loved that story. But when I watched it again on DVD, and it's prime for it's ripe for a reappraisal, a reappraisal by me. But when I watched it again, I found it very plodding. I was amazed. I'd kind of forgotten how many times the Doctor and Joe get imprisoned and put in a cell in that story. It must be at least 3 or 4 times, and I thought
Classic
this isn't
fourth
quite
episode
as
shenanigans.
great as I thought. Yeah, and I was also really impressed by watching. What I found sometimes was how I think probably the thing that impressed upon me the most was where I'd come to the end of a particular era, not necessarily a Doctor's era, but maybe a production era, and I'd kind of then, when I started watching the new version that was followed, when a new producer took over or something, I really noticed how impactful that was. Whereas before I could sort of dip in, watch one story here, watch one story there, having to watch all of like season 17. When I got then to start season 18, I really noticed the difference between the John Nathan Turner and the Graham Williams sort of eras overlapping, and the real. I really enjoyed that the second time through, whereas I'd sort of seen it bits and pieces and different stories over the years. Watching that, it really had an energy and a freshness that recalled even like the early John Pertwee era of a kind of let's have a real change and a mix up. And then it was
Yeah.
interesting to see how that then developed going through into Colin Baker's time, and some of the decisions and arguable missteps that were made along the way. That was something that I wasn't so conscious of beforehand until I watched them in order. So yeah, it enriched my experience overall, and I felt like, this was a great thing that I could do to give myself an excuse really to write and to edit and to do things, and it's kind of grown from there. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing at first in the sense of what it was for, and that's why, like you said, I think that's actually been a good thing, because like you say, it's a bit of a mixture of different ideas. There's a review element with an element of my personal opinion and appraisal, which makes it somewhat individual in that sense. But there's also a kind of a guide to things and a encyclopedia in a way of what's going on behind the scenes. It's kind of a mix. I called it review, but it's not. It's more of a.
An
It
overview.
sounds very pretentious, but it's kind of like a re-dash view in the sense that it's my reappraisal looking back at these things. I'm not really sort of saying recommending and reviewing according to a particular metric, and I don't, I don't claim to necessarily be completely objective as a reviewer should be, because I love Doctor Who, so I'm going to love all of it. But as you say, what I like, one of the things that's always been very, very important to me in general, and being an English teacher and having taught literature for years now, the context behind a production, whether that's a book or a television program or a film, I think is very, very important to understand in order to appreciate it. And I think that's something that I learned from an early age from Doctor Who, because at one hand, you can look at an episode from the 1960s and you could write it off if you were only to evaluate it with the modern expectation and perceptions of how television should be made. And until you understand some of those production contexts, whether they are things to do with budget, but also cultural expectations of television drama and how people consume television, how it was consumed, and what was going on in the time, I think that helps to. I mean, someone could say it could excuse faults. I don't see it as excusing faults. I see it more as enriching my experience of something. It's not supposed to be enjoyed in the same way as modern television with its kind of photorealistic expectations of things. It's a little bit like. Oh, this sounds very pretentious, but it's the only thing that jumps to mind. It's a little bit like if you watch a play from a completely different time period, like Greek theatre or something like that. That's a completely different way of staging drama than the sort of fourth wall kind of drama that we expect at the theatre today. So, similarly, I think it was that context thing that I felt that a lot of appraisals and reviews that I saw online were missing, and that was something that I've gone into more detail about as the series has gone on. I'd like to go back to some of those early ones, particularly like John Pertwee and stuff, not just to redo them so that the sound and visuals are better because I've got better equipment now, but also just to expand it and develop it a little bit more.
But
because I
like,
was a
yeah,
bit
you
worried about how long they were going on for. But now I know people will sit there and listen to me waffle on for an hour and a half. I can.
it was like you mentioned sort of coming to something, understanding the context. For example, like I'm a filmmaker and I really like the work of like Douglas Sirk, and there are melodramas with like presentation type acting styles. So you have
Mm.
to approach them knowing what you're getting and knowing the
Yeah,
era
yeah.
and style. But actually, I did want to just take that point, and I was revisiting the Sylvester McCoy video the other day, and you mentioned the Candyman, right? And I think that's a perfect example of, you see that bit from, I don't know what that Paul Merton show was, I can't remember what it's called, but taken out of
Room
context,
101.
Room
Yeah,
101. You show a picture
yeah.
of the Candyman, and obviously in a picture it
Mm.
doesn't speak to anything. But in the context, as you say, he's creepy. It's a contrast between
Yeah.
his design and his intentions. And I feel like in modern like TV now, I feel like if Neil Gaiman wrote an episode that had a character like that, people would approach it in a different way, as a kind of a Neil
Yeah.
Gaiman-y whimsical take on something, but just torn out of context, it
Mm.
doesn't mean anything, or you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the thing is I don't criticize them for making those decisions and taking those risks at that time, because it produced some really fun. I mean, the Happiness Patrol is a fantastic story, much better than some of the sort of quote unquote traditional type stories with the typical kind of monsters and things in it. I really like, and the performance that the Candyman has as well, I think is really great. I love the little, and the design of it. I mean, it is ridiculous, but it's supposed to be ridiculous in the same
Yeah,
way that the giant pink bouffants that the ladies have, their pink sort of double-breasted jackets they walk around. It's supposed to be ridiculous and silly. That's what makes it sinister. It's that
yeah,
contrapuntal thing. It's that holiday camp music blaring over everything. And I think it was very kind of, I don't know if ahead of its time is right, but certainly from the point of view of a television sci-fi production, that was something that was, as I say, was being developed, the style and the exploration of. I mean, if you look at something like Tim Burton's Batman, for example, which was what, 2 years later. I mean, you can see in that similar kind of outrageousness, and obviously the benefit of the production um,
like
style
budget.
of it. You know, taking something like you know, the kind of, because in the public consciousness, of course, then everyone thought of the Adam West Batman and of the ridiculous campiness of that, and there are traces of that, but twisting them and making them dark and scary. Um, and more sinister because of it. But yeah, I think that's a big thing. Unfortunately, at the time, people were tuning in to see if Doctor Who had returned to what they remembered, which I suppose was perhaps a sort of John Pertwee, the kind of realism of something like Spearhead from Space or something like that. I mean, it's still ridiculous, still Doctor Who. It's still got, you know, shop window dummies coming to life, but they saw that and thought, no, this is ridiculous, I'm switching it off. And still today, people go, oh, that Candyman. And I'd be interested to know if those people have ever actually watched the story.
Yeah,
But those things, they are, you know, on the face of it, but you know, they're the things that will either alienate a viewer or draw them in. And when your show is teetering on the kind of precipice of being cancelled, I think a more or a less confident or less perhaps less naive, because some people might say Andrew Cartmel, who made this considered a new writer who's coming in, had been steeped in comic books and things like that. Maybe he didn't realize the impact that might have on a general audience. But I think it was great that they did do those things, because it produced some fantastic television. But it's probably similar to the kind of interdimensional frog in the
it
13th
takes
Doctor
it takes
story,
you
in the sense
away.
that a lot of people just take that out and go, yeah, there's a frog on a chair. But in the story, it serves a different purpose, a different function, but it's that kind of bizarreness that actually makes Doctor Who unique. You know, I was talking the other day about how, you know, when you look at the Web of Fear, for example, which is this seminal 60s Doctor Who story, which is up in the top 10, if not the top 5 Doctor Who stories ever. When you think about it, it's got robotic Yeti walking around in the London Underground, firing webs out of guns that kill people, and disembodied intelligence trying to take the Doctor's mind and taking over. It's utterly ridiculous. It's utterly absurd, and yet it works within the paradigm of Doctor Who, within that format, and that's what makes it unique. That's classic Doctor Who in that sense.
Yeah.
And I think the problem was in the 80s and then in the 90s going forward is that they were looking at they were comparing Doctor Who against other properties like Star Trek, like Star Wars and things like that, which are fantastic examples of science fiction in their own right, but they serve a different function in a way. I think Doctor Who is much more of a realist magic kind of fantasy. You know, it's, as I said in my original video, it's in the tradition of Narnia and Alice in Wonderland. It's not the science, despite what Christopher Bidmead in the early 80s wanted to try and bring in and started talking about mathematics all the time, but it has scope for that. But at its core, it's that little weird police box at the end of the lane that you go in and there's a magical world beyond, and that's its fundamental aspect.
It's something that Moffat kind of would build on with his fairy tale aspects, like a planet where there's so much stars in the sky, it's like daylight and things like that. Those sort of little asides that he has. I did want to just ask you, going through the videos, I was just curious about, I think it's part 9 in which you talk about the wilderness years and Paul McGann. And obviously there's more to talk about in the fact that there was so much media outside the show. But I was wondering, was that video tougher without sort of like the anchoring presence of a Doctor that lasted a whole series? Obviously, you can talk about Big Finish and the novels, which you do. But was it like a harder one to structure?
Yes, it was. Yeah, and it's the one that I knew was going to be the most challenging. And the fact that I pulled it off, I actually find that's probably my favorite of the ones that I've done, and that's partly to do with the fact that that was the period in which I grew up, and I felt that there was also a lot. It was kind of a bit of virgin territory, so to speak, in the sense that it was an area that hadn't really been explored much within fandom, because I suppose it was something that was quite recent. Doctor Who magazine had done some great articles on the Virgin books and things like that, but it wasn't something that, I think it was one of those periods which I suppose I felt that a lot of people would be interested in finding out about, people that had come to the show since it had returned. You know, what was, especially with Paul McGann appearing in the 50th anniversary in the Night of the Doctor special, and people wanted to find out more about that. I felt that this was an opportunity for me to talk about stuff that perhaps people hadn't spoken about as much. So yeah, it was. I was thinking, you know, how am I going to do this? Because I knew the centerpiece was going to be the Paul McGann film, but I knew that to do it justice, I had to. And again, about context, I needed to do a bit before that, leading up to it, and then I needed to do what was the aftermath of that, and very much the time where I really got into Doctor Who and started exploring it. And I felt this is going to be challenging because I haven't really got video material to lay down and to talk over as such. Although generally I tend to try and find things that are visually relevant to what I'm talking about. I don't want to just put something in the background and then me talk over it like some people I've seen do, because I wanted it is a film, you know. I wanted the dial, what I was saying, to be supported and enhanced by the images. But I had a kind of a list of all the topics I wanted to cover, and I wrote it out. And I must admit, when I have a general kind of structure, but when I write it, I'm not necessarily thinking about how I'm going to visualize it. I kind of explore that and find it and improvise it in the moment once I've got the audio track down.
Does it come together?
And sometimes I kind of, sometimes I kind of curse myself because I'm like, why am I talking about this? I don't know what I'm going to show. And I can agonize over it for several hours until I'll search up clips and videos from random little interviews and things like that have been done over the years that I feel, that would go well there. I find the odd image. And I think the thing that I was most pleased with in the Paul McGann video was some of the stuff that I did that was more, I mean, it wasn't my creation because I'm a terrible artist, but I used some of the artwork that was in Doctor Who magazine to kind of create a little backstory of the New Adventures books, and kind of pseudo animated them and things like that. So I enjoyed the challenge of that, and because it's a period that's very close to my heart, it was something that I really it was a labor of love kind of thing. I didn't get too stressed out about it as such, but yeah, we got there in the end. I think yeah, and I did have to draw on a lot of things. I had to find one of the things that I found a little bit awkward was whenever I do a video, I try and use music from the era that I'm talking about, and restrict myself to that. And I also do that with the companion videos as well. And if you notice, like with the Brigadier one, it will start off with literally the music from one of his first stories, but we'll end up with music from the Sarah Jane Chronicles, because I think that music's very important to me, but also in Doctor Who a lot, it can be quite evocative of certain times and periods, and I want to kind of keep that style with the footage. But with the Wilderness Years one, of course, that was a bit challenging. I had all the music for the Paul McGann movie, which I mainly used leading up to it, but then afterwards I thought, what am I going to use as backing track? But fortunately I had some Big Finish soundtracks, which I then placed down, which I thought was quite suitable as well, because you can with the music
I think you did a really good job of introducing people to the Big Finish as well, which is such a sprawl. It's kind of, I think you gave a nice intro to that side of things.
Yeah, I mean that was tricky as well. Some and this is true of several different expanded media when I do cover things, is knowing what to say and what not to say, what to leave out, because I can't. There's more Big Finish stories than there are Doctor Who stories now, and I kind of got in there on the ground floor. I got the very first CD when it came out, and I had some of the Benny audios on cassette tape and things like that. So I've sort of been there for that whole period. But even I don't have. I've got a reasonably sizable library of Big Finish, but I don't have all of it. I remember the day when they only had one spin-off series, and then suddenly there's like 59 box sets, and I can't afford all of them. So. I thought I'd go in with basically what was the origins of this, how did it begin, and how did it develop, and the kind of the main range, the monthly range, and it's tricky because now, of course, for a lot of people, the stuff that they've done since the anniversary year has become kind of canon in a way for a lot of people, because it was kind of legitimized in the fact that the Paul McGann Doctor name checked his audio companions, and so now a lot of it is considered sort of canon, and you've got Kate Stewart and people like that carrying on in the audios. So when I talk about the companions, like when I did Susan and when I did Jamie and now with the Brigadier, I thought, well, I've got to mention how they've then continued on in Big Finish, certainly with Susan, because that is her, being in the Time War and things like that. I thought I've got to mention that. So sometimes when I do these things, I have to kind of I have to spend a bit of money just to collect these things if they're not already in my collection, just to catch up with things. I mean, I bought Sarah Jane Adventures and watched that so that I could talk about I don't know why I'd bought the entire collection just to talk about the Brigadier, but I didn't own those before, so I thought, well, there's the excuse. I better watch these, because I myself, I've never. It's not that I have anything wrong with them, but I was never really into the spin-offs. I didn't really watch Torchwood. I didn't really watch Sarah Jane, so. Yeah, it's been an excuse for me to do more research and more enjoyment of the program, but it's not work.
Actually, would you were talking about sort of like who is a companion, who isn't a companion. Would like Captain Jack count, because he sort of occupies a similar space to the Brig?
I think it's difficult.
Curiosity. Yeah.
Well, in the old days, the rule I think was that if to be a proper companion as such, you had to have travelled with the Doctor in the TARDIS across a story. So the Brigadier didn't technically count as a companion. But that also means that Katarina and Sarah Kingdom, who are both in the Daleks Master Plan, don't count as companions either. And I don't think that's entirely fair on Sarah. And also she's had a bit of a spin-off in the Big Finish audios as well. So... I think the new series made it muddied the waters a little bit, especially when you had the specials with David Tennant, because then I think most people would consider Wilf a companion, but he doesn't travel in the TARDIS between stories, and yeah, you've got friends and you'd say like Rory isn't a companion at first until he joins them. But is it in his first series or the second series? So it's all a bit confusing, really. There's not a hard and fast thing. I mean, I would consider Captain Jack a companion. Some people might not, because he's kind of like an agent, a free agent in some way. But I think it's interesting that the Captain Jack is mainly there in series 1 to act as everything is centered around the Doctor and Rose's relationship. So any other character who comes into that is there to service and develop that in some way. So you could say that Mickey is somewhat like that for series 2 as well, where he comes in for a few stories and then leaves. So it's difficult, and it's all down to personal sort of perspective. I think with the Brigadier, though, with my series, I have my main series, and then a while back, because a few people were saying, are you going to talk about this? Are you going to talk about that? And I thought, well, I need to cover, like, for example, I want to do a video at some point about the TARDIS, about the kind of the design of it and the in-universe kind of lore to do with it, which is not really necessarily constrained to a particular era, or wouldn't necessarily, if I chopped it up and stuck it in a bit in the William Hartnell era, a bit in the Patrick Troughton and so on, it might not flow very well. So I thought I want to do a video on that at some point. So I kind of thought I'll have a kind of an appendix series on different things. So there's one series I want to do about monsters and villains that look at, and one series about companions, and one about the TARDIS, and one video I want to do about the Peter Cushing films, because people always ask me about the Peter Cushing films. So with the companions, I thought I'll do this, but what I thought was, well, I don't want the Brigadier, who's such a seminal character, to just be out in the cold. I want him to be part of this companion series. For me, he counts. He's an honorary companion in that sense. And some people like to split hairs about it, but at the end of the day, I think he takes his place amongst the rest of them.
Yeah, and I feel like as a bridging point between the Pertwee to Baker eras, he's important. He's like an anchor as well.
I think the thing is that the Brigadier for me is more of a companion than Adam was in series 1, for example. So I'm not having Adam be a companion and the Brigadier not, in that sense.
But I did want to ask you as well, just about something that you're doing within this kind of sphere that's a bit more on the creative side. Can you tell people just about the Matrix and that thing that you're working on, the project there?
Oh, well, yeah, I've been doing that for a long time now. I haven't put as much time into it as perhaps I'd like to, because I know a lot of people expect my Doctor Who videos, and they take a lot of my time and work. So I wouldn't want, especially with patrons, donating generously to support me with that. I wouldn't necessarily want to waste my time on something that they wouldn't necessarily enjoy as much. But it's something that it was just after I did that John Pertwee video, I thought I'd like to do something a bit different, a little bit more creative. And one of the things that I've always loved, being a keen listener of Big Finish and audio dramas, is sound design. And I thought what I'd like to do is perhaps celebrate, rather than writing my own thing, I'd like to celebrate some of those books, some of those stories of Doctor Who that are harder to find now, that people might be interested in. So I chose a Doctor Who book called Matrix, which was published around 1998, I think it was. And it was quite a seminal book for me. It was one of the first Doctor Who novels that I read. It was part of the Past Doctor range. And it's a Sylvester McCoy and Ace story. And it has a lot of the features that I quite like about Doctor Who. It has a bit of gothicness. It's got a kind of a dark, it's kind of a bit of a horror story as well. It goes back to the Victorian period, and it's involved with Jack the Ripper in the East End of London, which is a favourite isn't the right word, but it's a subject that fascinates me, and the social history of that. And it was the first book, really, that not only one of the first books that I read of Doctor Who that I really enjoyed, but also the first book that I'd really read about the Whitechapel murders and that kind of thing. So it was kind of out of the 200 odd Doctor Who books I got, I thought that's the one I'll give it a go at doing. There's no too crazy sci-fi sound effects, or so I thought when I did it. So I wanted to do a reading of that. And at first I thought, well, after I'd recorded it's done in episodes, a bit like Doctor Who, so it's quite sort of easy to split up into parts. And I thought I'll just do a read. I'll put some sound effects down about footsteps and things like that. But as I did it, my kind of need to do all the sounds kind of came in. So it became a kind of a whole soundscape. I wanted to kind of flex my muscles a little bit to try and do a bit of a big finish, not in the sense that it's not an audio play, it's just me reading, but to take the voices of the characters and put them in a particular environment depending on where the book's described, and have the sound effects. And it's great fun doing all that kind of, sure, like making all different sound effects and getting overripe melons and chopping them up so you can get the sound of someone being stabbed and all that kind of thing. It's it's not really a family friendly Doctor Who, but it's it's a great story. And I've got there's 6 parts that I intend to do of it all, and I was very, very flattered when one of the authors, because it's written by 2 people, so one of the authors, Robert Perry, left a comment saying, "Oh, this is really lovely, please continue." So I was very, very flattered that he was impressed by what I'd done. So I do hope to pick that up and continue going with that soon, because the people, it's not enjoyed on the same level as all my other videos, probably because it's an audio and people go to YouTube to watch videos, but there's a few people there that really enjoyed it, so I'm quite pleased that they've liked that. And I like doing little audio projects like that. Sometimes it's something I've always enjoyed, doing the soundscapes and all that kind of thing, and I'd like to do some other things in the future. I'd like to do some collaborations with some people. There's quite more so even than when I started doing YouTube, there's quite a community now of people doing a lot of really great fan productions and different things, and I'd like to contribute to them in some way if possible.
And maybe like Big Finish, you might go from enthusiastic fans to professionals.
Yes, it has happened. It does happen, doesn't it? Yeah, I don't know whether I should. I've never been the kind of person who can go and kind of knock on people's doors, kind of thing. I kind of think that maybe I'm too. I don't know. I should promote myself a bit more and send off some emails. But I'd be more than happy. I'd be very honoured if I could do something with Big Finish or.
We're exactly the same. Elsewhere. I find it very hard to like sell myself or put myself out there, even though industry of like. But actually, I do. Actually, except for this year, but Paul Spragg, I try to get in something for that competition.
I keep every year that comes up, and I'm like, right, now's the time, because I have an idea, and I just never get it down in time. So I should really write it now, and then when it comes up next year, I can send it in. But
I just wanted to, as a final question, thanks for taking the time. But I just want to say, how is the Matt Smith era 11th Doctor thing going? Have you started? Are you still researching?
I'm still doing a lot of research on it. The thing about the modern eras is that there's less information that's easily accessible, in the same way that the history of Doctor Who is an act of scholarship in a way. There's so much stuff that's been done over the years. Andrew Pixley has done all the results, and there's some fantastic books called About Time that Tatwood has done over the years. And he's now doing the modern era, but it's harder in some ways to get information that isn't just part of the kind of the promotional material, and really get to grips, with what the ins and outs were behind it. I don't mean in the sense of the gossip and the backroom fights or anything, but just what actually happened, because they don't always want to be open with those things. So it's a longer process in a way to amass those things. I'm researching, I'm gathering information, watching things as much as possible, I'll be making a start soon, I think, on the actual recording of things. It'll be a little way off, I think, until I get it. I want to do it justice, because that's they're all my favorite, but that's a particular favorite of mine in that era, and I really want to do it justice. There's a few things that I haven't had time to fit in so far in the modern look at things. Like, I'd like to focus a bit more on Murray Gold in this episode, because I haven't looked at him so much in the first 2 videos of the modern era, but I think I kind of saved it for now, because I think this is where he changed his style a little bit, or rather, adapted to the style that Doctor Who changed to, and I kind of prefer the music of this era. So I'd like to look at that as a way of exploring the kind of the fairy tale side of the Moffat perspective or view.
The 11th Doctor's theme is one of my favorite pieces of music. It's so propulsive, and it absolutely sells the emotional energy that it needs to. Like,
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. It does become a little bit less bombastic than his scores in the sort of Russell T Davies era, and becomes a little bit more magical and a little bit more a fairy tale like. And that's, I frequently go back and listen to them, and so, you know, it's going to be a big video because I've got so much to cover. Obviously, I've got the changeover and Matt Smith and the change of style and look, and the kind of almost second reboot. I mean, the BBC was prepared for the show to not work and for them to cancel it, you know, and so there was so much riding on the 11th hour and on that episode, and they managed to pull it off. But then, of course, you've got the development of Doctor Who and its popularity in America. You've got the 50th anniversary. You know, there's so much to cover there that to do it justice, you know, it's going to take a while for me to really, you know, find because I could talk about everything, but the video would be 7 hours long or something, and no one wants to see that much. You know, I have to try and think what are the most important parts to sort of boil down and sort of make sure that one thing flows to another, so it's not just a kind of episodic bit at this, look at this and this. I need to try and find a through line to it. So you know, I mean, and a lot of people say, you know, they're looking forward to Matt Smith, and they ask me when the Matt Smith video is coming, and I take that as I'm kind of proud of that, because it means that, you know, at least people are looking forward to it and excited about it. But yeah, I try my best to do things as quickly as I can, but obviously with a full-time job, I wish I didn't have to work as well, you know, because I could dedicate myself to it, but that kind of takes it out of me sometimes. So yeah, I'll be working on it for the next few months at least, I think.
Well, I can't wait, because Matt Smith's probably my favorite Doctor, and also actually, just to take us back to RTD for a final kind of sign off, I think that the 11th hour is a great like pilot if you're trying to get people into it. And I know people love Rose and that whole thing, but I actually think the 11th hour is a stronger overall episode than Rose. I think people look with literally rose-tinted glasses back at Rose, I think.
Yeah. I think you're right, but I think that part of that is because Russell T Davies was very conscious of a wider audience, and so there's much more emphasis on Rose and seeing the Doctor and meeting the Doctor from her perspective than there perhaps there is with Amy. But yes, I think that that'll be interesting to look at, to say about how the audience expectation had changed somewhat. I mean, going from the New Year's Day special End of Time, where everyone watched it and David Tennant was on every ident, you know, it was kind of difficult to. I wouldn't have wanted to be in Stephen Moffat's shoes writing that, or Matt Smith's, you know, trying to pull that one off. So it's kind of amazing that they did, because I think any other show wouldn't have been able to do it. You know, you wouldn't have been able to come back from that. And so I think that's the thing that makes Doctor Who quite unique. And when you have been a fan for a long time, you kind of see it more, that there's that wonderful ability for it to regenerate, you know, that other shows don't have. You can reboot shows, you can remake, you can do spin-offs. But that idea of regenerating the show and changing a lot of the superficial aspects, the logo, the music, all that kind of thing, but still keeping the fundamental core elements of what makes it great, what it was originally when Sidney Newman and his team kind of conceived of it, is the thing that makes it endlessly sort of fresh, you know. So I think that as someone who's steeped not only in the lore of Doctor Who and the experience of being its head writer who brought it back, I think Russell T Davies understands that. I don't think we're going to see you know, a return to necessarily. Obviously there's going to be similarities, there's going to be motifs that Russell T Davies always has, there's probably going to be a few familiar faces as well, but actually, I mean, I don't think, you know, we're not going to get a remake of the Tennant era or even the Eccleston era. We're going to get new Doctor Who with a different kind of perspective, and I'm very pleased as well that Bad Wolf, the production company, is going to be co-producing it, because the work they've done with His Dark Materials, the 2 series I've seen of that, I've really, really, really enjoyed. So, you know, we've got the top people, haven't we?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing for you. I know I keep saying final question, but this is good. Right. No, I just what hopes would you have? So even just overall or superficially for the next Doctor, for the 14th Doctor, is there anything in particular personally for me, right, I understand, developing a nuanced take on it, but I'm sort of, I think I've had my fill of sort of like a dark, slightly duplicitous Doctor. Like, I wouldn't mind
Well,
just
I think
someone a
that's
bit
the thing,
more.
isn't it? Is that
Yeah,
with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor, they've gone, because obviously the Capaldi incarnation was so angst-ridden for most of his time
yeah,
that they had to really, with Whittaker, make her this kind of much more joyful, loving of life character. And I think some people have then been unfair on her portrayal because she's
yeah,
not an angst-ridden Doctor in that sense. I think Russell I mean, knowing what he's done before and the kind of characters he writes, is that he writes flawed characters in that sense. I hope he doesn't bring back too many of the messianic pretensions that we had in the Tennant
the
era.
hubristic kind of stuff at the end.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think we've done that in a way. Um, uh, but I think that one of the things that's a hallmark really of the Russell T Davies era, and why I think I'm quite hopeful for its popularity outside of fandom as well, because that's really what the BBC is going to be concerned by, is that love of adventure, of living. Sometimes I found it, being a kind of cynical, grumpy old git, sometimes I found it a bit cringeworthy when the Doctor and Rose would be like, yay, werewolves and stuff like that. But actually, I kind of appreciate that positivity, and I think that's something that Doctor Who has. I don't think that necessarily it's been as successful in delivering that, probably with the 13th Doctor, and that might be because the character development of her companions, because there's so many of them, hasn't necessarily always got to the point where we can kind of believe that, or they can really share that kind of enthusiasm in the same way. But I think that there's going to be a kind of I think the thing I've always recognized with Russell T Davies, and reading the writer's tale as well, that he put together with Benjamin Cook, which is a fantastic insight into what it's like to be a writer. And I hope he's a lot healthier with himself
yeah.
these days, because
I
I
was just
mean, I
thinking.
was I was a bit surprised when he came back, when it said he's come back, because I thought, well, he nearly killed him last time. I hope
Yeah,
he's learned to balance this thing. Up till
I,
5 o'clock in the morning smoking 60 fags is not
I,
it's not a
I like.
recipe for health.
As a writer, I actually think about his process all the time. Like his thing where he's like, he never makes a deadline and all that stuff. It
Yeah,
sounded
yeah, yeah.
so stressful. Actually, I really like that book. It's a fascinating insight.
Yeah,
And it's
really,
so,
really great insight. And also, I think what was fascinating about that is how self-critical he is of himself. It's enlightening to realize how harsh he is on himself as a writer and as a program maker. I hope that I mean, he was a very experienced and successful man then, but I hope his age and his experience has taught him to be a little bit more confident, perhaps, with his writing now, and to to really drill down, know what worked about what he did on Doctor Who, but also as a writer, what works or what doesn't work so well. But yeah, I think the thing, it's kind of infectious, even in a cynic like me, of that kind of enthusiasm that he has. When you just hear him speaking, he's always got an enthusiasm. He doesn't seem to ever. I can't imagine him sleeping. I can't imagine him tired. You
yeah,
know, which is the complete opposite of me, because I'm always tired. it's that enthusiasm and that energy that was so evident in Rose straight away. I mean, I remember watching Rose. I think it was first shown over Easter, and I was staying at my brother's, and we put it on, and I remember just being breathless at the end of it, not quite sure what to make of it, but just kind of breathless, because at the time it was a bit like even this is an unfair comparison, but I remember watching the Phantom Menace in the cinema originally, and it's comparable only in the sense that I found that the editing, the speed of that film was so I mean, now you watch it and it's kind of almost sedate, but at the time I left the cinema just kind of like, I think I need to see this again, because there was just so much stuff and it just went so fast. And Rose did that as well, not necessarily in the sense of throwing the kitchen sink in, but just kind of that speed and energy. I like the fact that Doctor Who slowed down a little bit and became some more measured to build up some scares and tension, but it was so, I think, necessary at the time, not to start it off as some sort of slow, ponderous reveal of the ancient Time Lord, but just to go straight into the action. You know, the first line that he said, "Run," was epitomized that kind of approach to the series, I think.
It's like they're shaking off the cobwebs, like,
Mm.
instantly, like, from
Exactly. And that's the thing now, is that coming back now, and whatever other people might think, I'm pretty sure, I can't say I know because I don't know him, but I'd be pretty sure that Russell T Davies won't see any of what's gone on prior to this his return as Doctor Who going off the rails, that he needs to save it. He will have enjoyed it. He will have loved it. He will have taken on board some of the things from that as a viewer, and he'll want to build on that and go forward. So I think his approach will be different. Even, I mean, if you look at when the series returned, I mean, with that first series, he had to make it popular, had to make it palatable for a wider audience. And then his lead actor leaves, so he has to do it all again for another year. And then after that, it was very much consolidating and sort of getting on that freight train and going forward, And he's had a few years now to reflect on that and think about it. He doesn't need to sell Doctor Who as such now. He doesn't need to prove to people that they could like Doctor Who, because most people who would have liked Doctor Who liked it that time. So now what he has to do is kind of recapture perhaps some of that wider appeal, that energy, that appeal to a wider audience, as I say. But I don't think he won't have necessarily the same objectives, the same endpoints that guide how he approaches the writing of it, I think.
Yeah, I would love to have seen what he would have done with Jodie Whittaker's 13, though. I wish he was staying on, actually.
I think that, I mean, it was the same way like when he did the Sarah Jane Adventure story with Matt Smith, the only time he obviously wrote for Doctor Who after that kind of thing. But yes, I think it would have been nice, but I think the only way that would have worked was if he would have taken her last story, and I think that would perhaps have been difficult for her, difficult for Chris Chibnall to go. That's his Doctor as such, and he has to finish her off, kind of thing.
Maybe we'll get, if there's a multi-Doctor story in the future, maybe we'll get Jodie Whittaker involved in that, because I do love that scene with in particular with Matt Smith and Joe in that Sarah Jane Adventures episode. It's lovely. Thank you so much.
That'd be nice.
Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.